Today we're taking a look at the work of William Trost Richards and how he handled detail or subtle value changes in his paintings. William Trost Richards was born in Philadelphia in 1833 and he died in 1905. He studied painting in Dusseldorf, Germany, at the Dusseldorf School of Art, where Albert Bierstadt also trained, and both Richards and Bierstadt were members of the Hudson River School painters. But Richards did not focus on the dramatic lighting or strong contrasts of a lot of the Hudson River School painters. Instead, he preferred the subtle changes in value, the softer colors, the kind of calm feeling you get from looking at his paintings. His goal was to let viewers look at a scene quietly without trying to impress or overwhelm them. He believed painting should honestly show what he saw and not express a lot of personal emotion. So he did not put a lot of himself into the paintings. Whereas when we look at Albert Bierstadt, here you have the real high drama, high contrast, and these are great paintings. You know, Bierstadt's Church, Thomas Moran. I've seen a lot of those, and they're beautiful to look at. And there's a lot going on, and they can hold your attention for a long time. But these guys would go out in the field, do pencil drawings, watercolors, gouaches, oil sketches, and go back in the studio and reconstruct kind of a made-up scene, taking bits and pieces from where they were and what they saw. But their goal was to create this highly dramatic feeling in their paintings, whereas William Trost Richards did not. It's a 9x13 watercolor / gouache at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. And it's a beautiful painting. You look at it and it could be a 40x50 inch painting because of all the detail and rendered so well. And the problem with painting a lot of detail, and detail is value changes. So he has these real subtle value changes within the dark and light shapes. You can see in the water here, this also is a gouache and watercolor. The problem with adding a lot of that subtle value change, which is, again, detail, is that it breaks up the big shapes and you lose your composition and everything becomes a muddled mess of tiny little value changes or detail. But Richards had a way of painting the detail, the subtle changes, but also making sure the painting held together. You can still see the solid dark and light shapes. The idea when you're painting is to break your subject down into as big shapes as possible. So I don't know, 4 to 8 is what Carlson would say. Look at your subject and construct 4 to 8. I think he might have said 4 to 6. Big shapes, then break them up into 2, 3, 4 at the most big value changes. Richards did a lot more than that, but he was still able to hold on to the big feeling or the feeling of the overall composition. And it's hard to do that when you're focusing so much on detail. If we zoom in here a little bit, this image kind of falls apart when I zoom in. It's not a great photograph of it, but it is just really subtly handled, and it's beautiful. All the reflected colors in the water, all the subtle little value changes using smaller brush strokes. And you can see the use of some transparent watercolor and gouache. And he really handled that stuff well. Now this was a smaller outdoor sketch. And it's in gouache. Not as detailed, but still he's looking at some subtle changes here. And he would combine pencil drawings, water and gouache studies, and sometimes small oils And I've seen a lot of these, especially in Chicago when I was at school there. Some of the older galleries had a lot of his real small gouache and small oil paintings. And they're really, really nice. This is another study watercolor with a little bit of look like white gouache in there. You can see those subtle value changes within the shadow side of the rocks. All these subtle value changes here. And it really describes what's going on. Now this is another gouache. Again, a lot of subtle value changes within the shadow. Not as much in the light, but a lot going on in the water. He's able to handle detail really well. So he's not interested in thick brush strokes. He's not interested in brush strokes at all being a part of the painting. It's all about the subtle value changes. Because he believed it really required careful study and observation. And it wasn't an idea of quick or emotional responses for him. Painting, it was about recording the structure and the beauty of nature rather than trying to show his own feelings through brushwork or really simplifying his subject. Now this is an oil painting. I don't know the size of this. We can zoom in a little bit. And again, all the subtle value changes in the clouds, the water. So if it's a larger studio painting, he would do this inside from smaller studies. This is a really nice one. It's a gouache. I don't know if it was done outside or in the studio. It looks studio painted. But just beautiful, subtle color and value changes. His palette was a lot of earth colors and black. So he's not going to use any strong cadmiums, strong blues or violets. It's going to be warm and cool earth colors, black, ochres, and he's going to rely on the subtle value change. And he was able to record those value changes so accurately. Just has a beautiful feel to it. And gouache, it's kind of an in-between medium between transparent watercolor and oil in that it's opaque and you treat it like oils. And of course it dries instantly, but it also reconstitutes once it's dry. If you lay a wet brush stroke of color on top of another, it'll get wet again. So it has a lot of forgiving qualities to it. But just beautiful, subtle stuff going on color-wise and value-wise in these rocks. And a lot of times when you're paying this much attention to detail, you lose the sense of light in the overall scene, but he doesn't here. It's really strong. And also the pencil drawings. Very accurately recording value changes, shapes of the trees. I assume they're accurate to what was actually there, don't know. But there's enough detail here, enough subtle, small value changes in the rocks, the trees, that you could do a painting from this. And that's a good exercise to do once in a while, to do an accurate drawing and then try and do a painting just from the drawing, where you have to use your own color sense. It's kind of a nice test of where you're at color-wise. I believe this is also a gouache. Again, looks a lot like oils because it's opaque and just a lot of detail. But that detail doesn't destroy the overall atmospheric sense that you get looking at this, or the sense of light. He's able to show the bright sunlight hitting the castle and the rocks up here. Then the light really shifts down a little darker as it goes. So real subtle value change, in other words, in all these areas. He painted New England along the coast, mostly. And this is a large file. And this is gouache also with watercolor and pencil. You can see the pencil strokes here, carefully laying out the drawing. Not so much careful detail, although there is some detail with the pencil in here. You can see it up in here. And then laying in washes of the watercolor. Beautiful job on the water. And just enough color to accent the values. You You can see here too the pencil work first. He's laying down on this rock. The thicker opaque gouache for the sunlit areas, and shadows are kept a lot thinner. But his original paintings are really interesting to look at. That's why this is a nice image here, because it's so big we can really zoom in and see his work in there nicely. Here's an oil. Don't know the size of this. And this one is not as detailed, although there's a lot going on in the water value-wise, and color, just beautiful color reflecting in the water. But it's a little more simplified. Here you see the brushstrokes. And here you see also some pencil. So this was probably a study for a bigger one, because it's a lot of brushstrokes showing. But beautiful color and value changes. So he was able to accurately catch what he saw value-wise and color-wise. And a little stronger color here too. Well, I have a few of my paintings here. I just want to talk about my idea of approaching detail. This is a 24 by 30, and I do have a lot of small value changes within the foreground and some of the background or the foliage of the trees. But again, I'm trying to reduce everything to as big a shape and as few values as possible. And if I can get it to that state first, which is more the block-in stage, then I can go back in and decide how many values to add to those big shapes. So like the trees here on the right and on the left, the aspens, the yellow aspens, I'm seeing one value in the shadow to start with, then I might add two more. But I try not to add too many values within the big shapes. In other words, in the lights here, I have two. I have a light and a halftone. And I have 2 to 3 in the shadow, and that's quite a bit. But it helps to decide how many values you want to show, as opposed to just starting to render all the details or all the value changes you see. So have in mind first, before you start, how many values are going to be at all the big shapes. And it's really important to reduce your subject to simple shapes first, so you can decide about the values. Here I have a black and white, kind of a zoom of the same painting, but it's a black and white, so you can see I have about 3 values in this grass. I have an overall dark, kind of a lighter dark, and then a darker accent. So my focus on that was 3. Now when I apply those 3 values, 2 of the values will mix together and create maybe another one. So there might be 4 incidental values, but I started out with just 3 definite values. Same thing with the shadowed foliage here. Probably have just 2 in the shadow foliage. Same thing in the background aspens. I've got 3 values there, kind of an overall halftone, a little bit lighter, and then a darker. Now here I'm allowing the brushwork to take over more than values. I'm using palette knife, brushes just loaded with paint, probably synthetic brushes, where I can just lay it in there pretty heavy. But I've got 2 values on the trees back in here, simple light and dark. I got some color change, but only 2 values. In the boat, starting out with 3, I have a distinct light value here, and then a halftone, and then the shadow, and then blending them together to create that subtle value change. But it helps to look at this side of this boat and just know I'm starting with 3 values. Otherwise, you're not sure how many values to put in there, and you're just adding more values as you think you see them. So simplify first, then decide how many values you're going to add. Here's another one where I'm starting big, simple values. 1 overall value for these trees in the background, 2 values for these green trees. Just the shadow and light to start with. Then I added a darker value in the shadow, and then some sky holes. Same thing in the foreground grass, a simple dark and light shape. Within the shadow, though, I've made the decision of adding three values. I got some dark, well, I have an overall shadow value, some darker values, and then a little bit lighter. And I apply those with thick paint, kind of loose brushwork, but I'm not interested in recording the subtle little value changes of the grass. And the minute you start doing that, that area is going to become really detailed, and you'll feel the need to bring everything else up to the same. So I tend to keep everything more simple, just render the details where I really want the detail. In this case, the barn probably has the most detail. It's the focal point. Sheep I've kept as simple as possible, trying to show just enough values to show the form. And I want the brush strokes to show because I want my painting to look like paint. William Trost Richards didn't want that. He wanted the real subtle value changes and no brushwork to show, but just to show the atmosphere and the light and the details in there. And they're really worth studying. They're just beautiful paintings. One more here of mine. This is done outside, the side of a house. And here, within the shadow of the white wall of the house, I pretty much, it's all just one value, except for the dark of the windows and the dark of the roof here. But what I do have in this shadow is color change. So I've got one overall value for the white wall side of the house. Then I have some viridian, some violet, some orange, little alizarin. Got about 3 or 4 different colors from light that's bouncing into the white shadow of the house. So some yellow, oranges from the bushes, some green. Warmth really bounces up underneath these overhangs, and they really turn very orange-like. But I start with one overall value, probably the slightly muted violet everywhere. Then I go back in and add the viridian, reddish orange, and greens. You can see the brush strokes here. I really want these brush strokes to show. I'm not interested in recording exactly what's there, just trying to interpret and suggest what's there and suggest the light with using big, bold brush strokes. Again, because I want it to look like paint as opposed to, or reference, or what's exactly there. And we'll see you next time.